Millions of people injecting, inhaling, and ingesting drugs of all kinds and paying dearly for it. These people are often outside the law, certainly beset by many medical problems. Due to injection drug use, including psychosis, HIV, hepatitis C, and cancers, they die of overdoses. This is trench warfare, and the people that are on the front line soldiers are dying from it. These are people affected by addiction. Addiction is not a choice. It's not a moral failure. It's not even an ethical lapse. It's not a weakness of character. It's not a failure of will. That's just how ignorant and narrow-minded people in society depict addiction. It's not an inherited brain disease either, which is how the medical industry sees it. It's actually a response to human suffering. And people have been severely traumatized as children in some way. Women have been sexually abused. Men have been traumatized, some of them sexually, physically, or emotionally neglected. It's what the scientific and research literature shows us. Addiction is actually, rather than being a disease of human choice, is actually an attempt to escape suffering temporarily. The impact of early childhood experiences on adult psychology and adult brain physiology is staggering. The depth and degree of trauma is very palpable. Addiction is a response to suffering, and what people need in response to addiction is not judgment and not simply symptom control. They need to be helped to heal from their trauma, because it is all about trauma. The media, television, and cultural depiction of addicts is usually of desperate people, but without showing why they're desperate. All this shows is the desperation for the drugs. There's no indication of what's driving that desperation, and then you see them behaving in all kinds of dysfunctional ways. They behave in aggressive or manipulative or unpleasant ways, but again, there's no three-dimensional sense of the reality of these people. So is it possible to cure people? Well, if you're speaking from the Western model, and you're the one with the disease and you expect someone to cure you, it isn't going to happen. You can't cure people like you can cure a piece of meat. If you're asking if it is possible for people to heal from trauma sufficiently, that they don't have to keep escaping into addiction to lessen the suffering of their trauma, then yes, that's entirely possible. But the question is, under what conditions is that possible? If you go anywhere like London, UK, Vancouver, British Columbia, Paris, France, New York, or LA in the US, or any other place under the conditions where addiction breeds socially, the likelihood of treatment is rare, because we're approaching it from the wrong direction and with the wrong perspective. If we could constantly demonstrate with this particular population, we could get a 5 or 10% success rate of people to leave the addiction behind. We would be considered geniuses if we did that. Addictions are like everything else on a spectrum. So a lot of people do heal from addictions, but the most entrenched addicts have the hardest time, and they're also the ones whom society gives the hardest time. So that makes it even harder to help them. They actually get actively punished. So what you've actually got is traumatized children who grow into traumatized adults. When children are traumatized, that affects how they feel about themselves, which is deeply ashamed, because the child always believes that it's about himself. So if I'm being hurt like this, I've got to be a terrible person. Or if I was sexually abused, why didn't I fight back? I must be a very weak person, right? That's how they think. So there's a deep sense of shame, and then there's tremendous emotional pain that accrues from abuse and neglect. Tremendous emotional pain that is hardly possible for people to bear. And now they have to soothe their pain with substances or other compulsive behaviors rather than heal the trauma itself. The human brain develops an interaction with the environment and shapes the brain's circuitry in such a way that a person will more likely find relief from drug if they can't find relief anywhere else. It's not illegal to drink yourself to death. It's also not illegal to make yourself sick with emphysema or lung cancer by means of cigarettes. But it is illegal to use other substances. Now take these abused, traumatized people and you place them outside the law. You put them in jails and prisons, and you hound them all their lives, treating them like criminals and bad people, failures and rejects, less than human. and we wonder why they don't get better. It's a self-perpetuating cycle of traumatized people being re-traumatized, and then hoping at the same time for them to listen and improve. Why don't they get better already? Why don't they just give it up? Well, they don't give it up because the more they hurt, the more they need to escape. In other words, addiction isn't the problem. The problem is emotional pain. They don't know what to do to relieve the pain, so the addiction is really an attempt to solve a problem. Not a very good way to solve a problem, but certainly some kind of way. As children, we don't have the internal resources to cope with trauma. This is not a judgment, it's simply how we act and react at some point. Now, as adults, we have the internal resources to deal with that pain in a more creative, forward-looking. This helps us resolve the pain rather than to perpetuate it. So why do people use substances? Why do people engage in addictions? Because they have deep emotional problems. They often don't have the means to resolve them on their own. That's why they use. The average medical student, until very recently, has never even heard the word trauma in their education. We don't talk about it, or its impact on the brain, personality, emotional intelligence, or its impact on physical health. It's not a word that we like to mention in society. We're trauma-phobic. Psychiatrists are trained mostly in a biological model of psychiatry, where everything comes down to a biological brain disease. Let's give you a pill, they say. The last thing most psychiatrists know how to do is talk about emotional pain or its urgency in the human experience. You'd think they'd know how to do that, but they don't. They're not trained in it. That's the job they push off to a counselor. It's not part of the predominant medical ideology, and there have certainly been great scientific achievements in biological and brain science in the last 100 years. But in regard to trauma, there's one simple question that could solve so much. Why are you in so much emotional pain? What are you still carrying around with you on the inside? And how can we help you release it? Solving your problems and getting you to overcome the behavior in healthy ways is the key. That's when real healing and change happen. It's never about how we can cure the person. It's asking the right questions until we get healthy change. Take care of yourself.